As the primary antagonistic force in the longest-running arc of Bleach, the Espada hold an immense popularity within the fanbase, with some of them even being synonymous with the series itself. Everything from their character designs to their individual abilities, not to mention their varied personalities and motives, exemplify the pinnacle of Kubo's range and creativity. As you can imagine, Ulquiorra is one such character that benefits the most in the latter half of this arc, primarily due to his rivalry with Ichigo. But while majority of the Espada get a semblance of a backstory in the canon manga, abridged as they may be, nothing of the sort is done for Ulquiorra. Instead, an expanded narrative of his origins is covered in the Unmasked character book, essentially featuring elements that revolve around the themes of renunciation and nihilism. The Unmasked character book contains 11 pages of anecdote which are rather poetic in nature. Most of the literature represents an internal monologue from Ulquiorra, presented in a manner that portrays introspection in its most base and profound form. The first page is a pitch-black spread with only the words, "Not B, but B," which summarily condenses Ulquiorra's perspective on his own existence. It brought my attention to the thought experiment of Schrödinger's cat, a hypothetical scenario where you place a cat in a box with a tiny bit of radioactive substance and seal it. If the radioactive substance decays, it releases a poison that kills the cat. However, the decay of the substance in itself is an indefinite presumption with no evidence to conclusively support its eventuality or lack thereof. If the box is sealed and there can be no observer to examine its contents, then who's to say whether the cat is alive or dead? So the whole system stays as a combination of the two possibilities. The cat ends up both dead and alive at the same time. In the same token, Ulquiorra from very early on pondered the meaning of life and the polarity of ceasing to exist while still alive. We then move on to the second page where we see a crescent moon through a pinhole in the shape of an inverted cross. And this seems to be from Ulquiorra's point of view because it's followed up by him asking, "What is there?" And what's interesting is the lens through which he sees what he sees. You have to ask yourself, why an inverted cross? Does it mean something, or is it just a coincidence? Kubo is and always has been very particular about symbols, so you'd have to think it serves a purpose. Incidentally, if you've watched any horror movie based on religious context, then you'll know that it's often used as a symbolic totem to represent hostility to the creed of the church. In a nutshell, we are talking about anti-Christianity specifically. But on a wider scale, at its core, it represents paganism, an extreme antipathy to all of the widely known religions, better known as atheism in more interactive forums. Fundamentally indistinguishable from nihilism in the sense that intangible conceptions are met with non-acceptance and faithless disbelief. So very early on, we can see how all these little details serve as an allegory of Ulquiorra's nihilistic proclivities. As we go along, we finally get a third-person view of Ulquiorra himself. It shows him sprawled out on the ground, immersed in what appears to be an entangled myriad of roots and branches. His eyes are now fully open and he affirms that there is nothing within and nothing without. Obviously a rebuttal to the inquiry he made on the previous page. He has a humanoid form, lanky arms and legs buried beneath the branches. His mask covers all the way up to his forehead like a hat, and it has these long horns protruding from either side of his head, just above where his ears should be. He very much resembles his resurrection form, and if there's one takeaway aside from the fact that there's virtually nothing and no one in sight, it's that his appearance is clearly that of a Vasto Lord. Following the chronological sequence of events, this is his final showing immediately leading up to his encounter with Aizen. The little we've seen so far are the last recorded moments preceding his installment as an Espada, and everything that happens in between remains a mystery, including how long after this it took before he finally met Aizen. Then we get to the next page and we are taken all the way back to witness the moment of his inception. And the jury is still out on how holos actually come into existence, but this is probably as close as we can get to a real explanation. In his monologue, he claims that in this very instant he was born. The obvious implication is that he has no memories of any life he had lived prior to this moment. Whether it's his experiences as a human or potentially those he may have had as a Menos, this world he had found himself was essentially foreign to him. We see him emerge from the bottom of a pit, enveloped under a cover of limitless darkness. And assuming this is a basic blueprint for the creation of holos, then essentially holos materialize from holos. As you can imagine, his first impression is that of self-doubt and hesitancy. Everything as far as the eye can see is shrouded in the darkness he believes to be his progenitor. He looks at his blemished right hand and notices his white form. However, he's not alone in this drab, vapid pit. His comrades, as he refers to them, are all pitch black. Only their teeth and eyes gleam through the darkness, and he can tell that they are feasting on something. And unlike Ulquiorra, we at least have the benefit of foresight to know that they're probably feeding on each other. After all, the very essence of evolution for holos is contingent on cannibalism. The next page gives us a more comprehensive look at Ulquiorra's image. In contrast to his appearance on the third page, his mask fully covers the entirety of his head. His form is completely white with black wings projecting from his lower back. Through their silhouette, we can tell that the others have a facial structure akin to humans with similar horns and appendages to Ulquiorra. He looks on as the others devour their prey and realizes that he is different. Only his eyes exist, nothing else. He's hesitant to approach them and he peers at them like an outcast would. From his perspective, there's a very ominous feel to the way they perceive him in that moment. It is then that he understands that those he carelessly thought to be comrades had shunned him and sought to devour him like they had done countless others. His fallen eyes at the bottom of the page tell the story of a pariah whose first lesson in life had been that of rejection. On to the next page, and we see him wandering the vast dunes of Huecomundo in total isolation with nothing in sight. A streak of blood is visibly splattered on his mask with more copious amounts dripping from his hand, and you have to assume that he killed them. We don't get to see it, but that's the impression we get. It's perfectly plausible and more than likely that their brazen hostility translates into a physical attempt to devour him, and Ulquiorra, out of a primal drive, retaliates by killing them. He presumably impales each of them clean through their chest in the same manner we've seen him do in the canon manga, an inexplicable habit born out of instinctual curiosity. He laments his predicament, and you can practically taste the dejection in his words. I felt nothing. No, rather, it was possible that what I felt was void. He was forsaken and lonely. His hearing, taste, sense of smell and touch were practically non-existent. All he could rely on was sight, and because none of his other senses worked, he lacked a connection and an intimacy to anything in his vicinity. They were all as impalpable and meaningless as the darkness from whence he was born. But because all he had were his eyes, the things he could not see equally did not exist. We see the gradual descent of coming to terms with the sorrows of living, devoid of the faculties that give worth to a life. Such are the woes of a lonely soul. The next page has him walking around for what seems like ages. Could be months, could be decades, who knows. And he eventually comes across an enormous tree that captures his interest. For the first time in his life, he feels an affinity, something that, in his eyes, is as meaningless an existence as his own. In seeking connection, he projects his own emptiness, his deep, deep cosmic void. It had no color, no sound, and no scent. It merely stood there all alone, like him. And its existence is the closest thing he feels to kinship. Reflected in his eyes is an object whose meaning he could not perceive, not because of his own deficiency, but simply because there was nothing to perceive. In his contentment, he embraces the tree and buries himself into the great void that it personifies. As he sinks deeper, the branches break his mask, almost as if to symbolize that the essence of his lost heart had found satisfaction in the nothingness of the void. He loses his line of vision and becomes one with the tree. Relinquishing what remains of his physical senses, he dissolves into nothingness, and this, to him, is ultimate happiness. And we see an image where he blends in at the center of the tree as nothing more than a shadow. With naught but a concealed form, he achieves a state of peace and tranquility within his very being. All of this is a lead-up to the first 3 pages when he wakes from a deep slumber, but it still remains unknown how long he was submerged within the tree. His mask doesn't seem to have regenerated by the time he awakes, so it could be that in his acceptance he had found relief, however minuscule, from some of the despair that had turned him into a holo. Perhaps it never did regenerate and Aizen encountered him in this Arranca-like form. Arranca basically meaning a holo that had shed off part of its mask. Perhaps, and this is a stretch, the use of the Hogyoku on an already established Arranca may have been the reason that he attained a second release as an Espada. A hypothesis with several holes, I admit, but one that tables the need for a more advanced, expanded discussion. The last 3 pages occur after Orihime's integration into Aizen's group. Ulquiorra wakes up from his sleep, and it's implied that he was recalling his past in a dream. Dressed in the typical Arranca clothes, Orihime, seemingly as cordial as ever, casually expresses her amazement at the fact that Ulquiorra is capable of sleep. He doesn't think too much of it, but instead takes offense to the way Orihime chooses to address him. He sternly tells her to refer to him as Ulquiorra, simply Ulquiorra, just as one would refer to an animal or an object, without honorifics, and denoting that he was the farthest thing from a contemporary. Complete and utter rejection of even the slightest nuance of any perceived humanity within him. There's an airy atmosphere as Orihime contemplates the depths of his withdrawal. His more impressionable past has ingrained in him a distorted contentment in a life of solitude. As if recalling his time within the void tree, his mental monologue continues. If such a thing called happiness exists in this world, it should be something which resembles the limitless nothing. Nihility is having nothing and having nothing to lose. If that isn't happiness, then what is? The serenity he finds in his detachment has shaped him to seek nothing, and to believe that the resulting gratuity of nothingness is the epitome of happiness, and that, for better or for worse, is how he lives his life. But what do you guys think? A lot of the text was open to interpretation, so tell me if you agree or disagree with my rendition of his backstory. If you stayed to the end, leave a like and comment on the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay safe. Peace!
You